Hi everyone, thank you for attending our webinar on finding your product market fit. We're very excited to be able to share with you some of the learnings and processes that we've put in place on the topic. But a bit of housekeeping before we begin. We're using Demio, so for those of you unfamiliar with how Demio works, attendees don't have audio or camera display. So don't worry, you're not on camera. We want this session to be interactive though, and we want to run a Q&A at the end. So please, there's a chat bar on the right-hand side. If you could use that to ask questions when they arise, and we'll come back and address them at the end. My name is Yanni. I'm the head of marketing at WorkingMouse, but you're not here to hear from me. We have two fantastic presenters today, and I've had the privilege of working with both of them for the past 3 years. But Geordie is the head of product success at WorkingMouse. She, along with her team, focused their work at the start of the project in order to validate the solution with user-driven data and set it up for success. She's a user experience designer by trade and is a big advocate for design thinking. Jake is the head of operations at WorkingMouse. He's responsible for ensuring that our way of working is continually updated with learnings that we make from each project. He was previously a user experience designer as well, and loves helping clients find their minimum viable product. So I'll pass over to each of them to take it from here.
All right, thank you, Yanni. So let me get started. Today, we're going to go through, obviously, some strategies that we use every day while we scope and develop software for our clients. Bit of an agenda. So we're going to go over a bit of who WorkingMouse is and what we do, first of all. Then get into the product market fit and also our way of working and how that ties into what we do. And then we're also going to touch on the fact that your MVP is just the beginning of your software journey. And we'll touch on those Q&As at the end. So Yanni gave us a pretty good introduction, but in case you couldn't put faces to names, I am Geordie, and so I'm the head of product success at WorkingMouse. Like Yanni mentioned, I started out as a UX designer, graduated from QUT and then started with WorkingMouse. But then during my time also, I've been a squad lead, which is like our Scrum Master role for a development team. And that gave me a lot of learnings around how, as a designer, how my decisions impact the development team and also how best to lead and remove impediments for them. So I'll throw over to Jake to fill in a bit of his background as well. But like Yanni said, he had a similar journey to me, and we've both been at WorkingMouse for almost 3 or 4 years now.
Yeah, so as Yanni said, thank you for the intro. My name's Jake, and I am the head of operations. We've had a very similar journey, Geordie and I, in that we started as UX designers, became squad leads. The difference is now that I'm sort of managing that way of working process and working directly with our squad leads. So that's all about delivery, what we're doing during our development iterations, and making sure that we're delivering as expected for our clients. I think that's probably about it for the moment on the intros.
As you can see as well, we don't take ourselves too seriously. We like to have a bit of fun at our workplace. All right, so what is WorkingMouse? Well, I thought we'd give a bit of a background, as some of you may not be too familiar with what it is that we do day in, day out. But we're a software design and development company, and we work with our customers to digitally transform and modernize their businesses. So we primarily develop web and mobile applications, but also supply some static marketing websites as well. We've had experience in a range of different industries. So we've worked with government organizations, large enterprises, and early startups. And I was going to say that that's actually one of my favorite parts of this job is the versatility and variety of industries that we work across, and the fact that you could be designing an accessible holiday platform, booking platform one day, and then a concrete precast design tool the next. So I've learned a lot of different, or the ins and outs of different industries working with the clients that we do. So to give you more of an insight into our company's history, I thought I'd just give you a couple of quick facts. So we were founded back in 2013 when our fearless leader, Eben, who you can see is also a massive Star Wars fan, he realized that there had to be a better way to develop software. And at this point, he was working out of iLabs in UQ. So he'd previously completed his PhD in model-driven engineering, which has heavily influenced the tech that we use today, which is CodeBot's platform, and I'll touch on more of that soon. So in 2016, we moved into our Hawk and Drive office in St. Lucia, and we grew to 30 people there. And as you can see, it got pretty cramped. And looking back at these photos, I feel pretty COVID unsafe. And then in 2018, we've now moved to Milton, which is our current office, and we're just next to the train station on Railway Terrace. So WorkingMouse alone has 33 employees at the moment and counting, while the total company group has about 70. And we all switched to a work from home arrangement too during COVID, which worked out really well for a lot of people. And we got some really great feedback from our clients working online as well. But I'd say we're probably half starting to trickle back into the office on a regular basis. So good to get back to some normality. And we're a part of the East Cottage Industries family, as I mentioned before, the company group. So we've got CodeBots, WorkingMouse, and Rogue 2 as a part of it. So CodeBots is the technology and the platform that we use to model and build our applications rapidly. And Rogue 2 are our support company that deal with all of our DevOps and supports the products once we've released them into production. And another quick fact, we love a good murder mystery party. So we've done Star Wars, disco, bit of Wild Wild West, pirates, we've done it all. But you can also see our current CEO, Maddie, in here somewhere. He's the Chewbacca. Yep, there he is. All right, so on to the good stuff, product market fit. So let's start with a few basics. The most popular definition for it is that you're in a good market and that your product can satisfy that market, which is all good and well to say, but how do you know when you've actually achieved it? And Mark Andreessen best describes this as a feeling. So you'll know when it's not happening because you're feeling that pain, right? Customers aren't quite getting the value of your product. Word of mouth isn't spreading and usage isn't growing that fast or as fast as you'd like it. And likewise, once you do eventually achieve it, you'll notice that your customers are buying the product as fast as you can make it or develop it. So you're run off your feet trying to meet the demand for traffic. So why is product market fit so important to achieve? In short, because your business can't afford to grow, or you can't grow your teams or focus on those other really important strategic objectives like upselling until you know that you have a product that users are willing to actively use or pay for. So you need to find out if the market you're in is large enough to sustain itself as well, which you can only really do that through an iterative development process. And you're conducting a lot of market or user testing to continually learn. And you focus on your core product as well. So just focusing on what it is at the core that you do, and that will give you the best opportunity to scale with a valid product offering. So what do I need to do? And in the product, the agile methodology, I should say, we refer to a lot about the product owner. And I'm going to assume that most of you listening are probably performing the role of product owner for the projects you have in mind. In which case, it's important for you to keep these points in mind because the product owner is a really crucial part of the success or the failure of a product, especially when you're in that early MVP and takeoff phase. So define a single product owner is a really big one. There needs to be one point of contact for the development teams, or not a point of contact, but that decision maker. And be a product owner, not a dictator. You need to be listening to all the metrics and the learnings coming in not just dictating a product that you want to build. You need to allow your product owner to dedicate a lot of time with your developers. So building and designing a quality project is often a near full-time job, I would say. So if that's not something that you can dedicate most of your working week to, then I would probably look to find, is there someone you can hire or someone in your organization that does have that time and will be able to dedicate everything to it, essentially. Fall in love with your problem and not your solution. This is one of the biggest traps product owners fall into, I would say. Once you have a solution in mind and you have this awesome idea, how could it not be successful? But that is the tricky part, because what you are trying to do is solve a problem. The problem is real, but maybe your solution isn't the thing that's aligning. And the final thing is to understand that your users are your greatest resource. So use them to measure, learn, and keep building. Don't release a finished product without it having been in the hands of someone beforehand. All right, so our way of working. If any of you have ever met with us or scrolled through our website, I'm sure you probably heard about us talk about this. It's our Bible for ensuring a tight design and development cycle for our clients. And we've all actually, I've got my physical copy in front of me now. You always have it on you. And it's crucial to everything we do to ensure we're always delivering value to you or to your clients as well, so your customers, the end user. It allows us to be completely transparent with you as well about how we develop our software. But the most important thing about the way of working is, although it is a physical document, it doesn't stay stagnant, and we're always identifying opportunities to experiment or to improve the processes in it. But the reason I wanted to structure our talk around it today is that our processes have been built around putting our clients' projects in the best position to achieve product market fit. So our process, the overarching process looks like this. So all of our clients will be sitting in one of these phases at the moment. Brief comes first. That's where we initially meet our clients. Then we move in and into an engagement cycle. So we are scoping and developing. And during that time, we've got our agile ceremonies, and then we release products into support. But what I'm going to do is break down the most important phases for you today that relate to product market fit. So in the brief, we always start with a problem. So looking at what problem are you solving? It's the most important thing about building something. You have to answer that question. But more often than not, when product owners pitch their idea, they'll often just tell you, what their idea is. And that quickly gets them into a solutions-focused mindset. So when we're coming in to scope and to solve the problem, we've actually already got the solution in our mind. And that can be quite dangerous, unless you've really vigorously validated that beforehand. And if you don't know what the problem is, you don't know whether you're solving it or you're making progress towards solving it or releasing something that is useful to someone. Another thing to ask is, have you experienced the problem yourself, or do you know someone that has? Making it personal is handy, but knowing that there are people out there that has experienced this problem firsthand is really beneficial. The next thing is to define your problem narrowly. So find something you can address meaningfully and quickly. So just focus on who you can help first, and don't skip this and try and solve everything for everyone straight away. Because if you focus on that one persona that you can help first, it means you can develop something and get it into their hands sooner. And the sooner you do that, the sooner you learn and hopefully provide them with something even better the next time. So market research won't actually help you find problems worth solving now is another good point, in that a lot of them have already been solved if there is market research for it now. Otherwise, if you are doing that, you've got to have a unique value proposition if it's an existing problem. And there are plenty of examples of that out there. And also, is the problem actually solvable? That is a really important part to validate, especially with software as well. So what does a problem statement look like? I've just done a demo one here that is quite relevant to us at the moment, but always start with a how might we. So how might we monitor the temperature of people entering our workplace to prevent the spread of illness? And the beauty of this statement is that it's defined narrowly, so we know that we're solving this problem for a specific audience, staff, and who are entering a workplace. We know that that's something that people do. It's summarized in a sentence. It's easily communicated and people understand it, and that it's achievable as well. So doing this exercise helps us to determine if the problem is technically solvable. And also in the brief, it's important that we know that WorkingMouse is the best fit to solve the problem with you. And another important thing to remember here is that building software is a journey. So it's vital that we're on the same page about which problem we're solving first. I'm not saying that this is the only problem that your platform will ever solve. It's just the first one, so that we can start winning. All right, moving on to the scope phase. So in this phase, the biggest thing to know is getting to know your customer. And I can tell you now that it's almost never everyone. The biggest thing is, again, defining that first customer. Who can you help first? And also then to talk to your users. So listen to their problems and not what their wish list is, because users rarely know what they want, but the problems they're facing are real. And what they're complaining of and those pain points that they're reporting are real. So it's your job to read between the lines, I guess, and try and find a solution to the things that they're facing. And this is what our product success team do really well in. And we do this by calling user groups, talking, just having a discussion with them, and finding patterns in all of the data that we're collecting. And another thing to take note of is how frequent and intense is the problem for your customer. So how often do they face this problem? And when they do, how much of a hassle is it for them? Those are the problems that they will really be willing to potentially, the next point is pay to fix it. So when you're solving a problem that is that intense and happens often, they will most likely be willing to pay for a solution. But you need to test this out with your user group. And lastly, know who isn't your customer. That's also just as important. So be careful listening to issues from people who don't have the problem that you're trying to solve. You don't want to shape your product around these people just because it's your mom and your dad use it and think it's great. Don't shape your product around them if they are not the target audience. And when should you start billing is often a question that we face a lot. It is a tough one, but the textbook answer is, if you ever intend to charge customers to use your product, start charging them right away. It's because it's the best way to find out if your problem, again, is intense or frequent enough. And if you go free initially, more people may use your product, but will they ever actually intend to pay for your product? So hobbyists that sign up and play around with it for free probably aren't people you should be designing your solution around. They don't really have your problem, and they certainly won't end up paying to solve it. But I've caveated that there. So on the other hand, integrating payment providers into software, that costs development time. So you need to weigh that up, because that time could be spent building more MVP features. So you always need to weigh up what works best for you, essentially. And obviously, if you're never intending to charge your customers, then you don't need to do that. Obviously, you've got paid advertising or something like that in your platform to counteract that. So yeah, I just had a point here about this is something that we've made a lot of learnings on in WorkingMouse as well. But our mindset at the moment is that if you're ever going to charge for the use of your product, it's important that we prove that there is a user group out there who are willing to pay to solve it as soon as possible. All right, so now we're going to move into our development phase, and I might actually pass over to Jake to take it from here.
Geordie, I believe, dropped out momentarily. Would you be able to keep going with development until he jumps back on?
I sure can. So, all right, let me start off. So when we move into development, this is where we focus on delivering all of the plans we've done so far. So it's important to remember the users during this phase. If you can show your users the progress that you're making and you get feedback during development and adapt it, you'll be in a stronger position when you deliver your MVP at the end. So quite often we will scope a project and release it into development for building, but it's just as important that you continue that design thinking methodology and be testing with your users while development is happening. So we often release iteratively every couple of weeks so that you can get your product into the hands of your users and learn while development is ongoing. Sounds like we might have Jake back.
Yeah, apologies about that, everyone. Just dropped out there.
You're right.
Yep.
I just finished introducing development.
You might just flip over. So yeah, obviously the big thing in development is building that MVP. So an important thing to remember when you are building your MVP is that it's not supposed to be necessarily special. We understand for many of you that this would probably be your first experience building software, but it's important to know that your MVP has the core purpose of validating your problem, not necessarily delighting your users straight out of the gates. So a generally overlooked point is that your MVP doesn't need to be scalable as well. So you can make decisions while you're building your MVP that you wouldn't dream of applying with thousands of users. Once your business grows, you can build in features that will allow you to automate some of those processes, but it's okay to not be at that point where everything is perfect, as long as you're able to once again validate that problem during that phase. Another important consideration for your MVP is how long you want it to be. So, or the other consideration is how much it would cost. So the longer your MVP build is, the longer it will be until you get your first round of feedback. You can get feedback during the MVP build, but it's a little bit harder, right? You haven't necessarily built a full iteration of the product. So it's probably going to be when you deliver that first MVP.
Jake's frozen for me, I think. So I might just sub back in. Sorry about this. Yeah, so while you're building the MVP, make sure you're focused on that iterative process. So we've built our way of working around this methodology. So it allows you to build in iterations like I was just mentioning earlier. And the feedback gained from this can be immediately applied into the next iteration if that's necessary. So even though, and we see it time and time again, you've scoped out the original plan, there are always little decision points along the way that you can slightly, move and improve.
Okay.
All right, he's back.
I'll give this one more try. Otherwise, I might give up. So yeah, we'll flip over here. Just want to have a few examples of what we think were fantastic MVPs that weren't necessarily the most flashy MVPs. But in retrospect, they accomplished the goal of every MVP and they got them out in front. They started to validate some of these major assumptions they were making, and it cost them very little money. So you've got Airbnb, Uber, and Twitter, which are some of the biggest examples we obviously have. So Airbnb started, the founders basically saw an event coming up in San Francisco, and they saw that hotel prices jumped. And what they decided to do was they bought 3 mattresses and hacked together a website, released it out there and said, hey, do you want to buy these 3 mattresses to stay over the weekend for this event? And they sold them immediately. So straight out of the gate, they built this website and they validated their assumption that would people buy accommodation in someone's house online. Obviously, they had some bigger assumptions to validate, is that would people post their own house? But they got the ball rolling there, and for a very little amount of effort, I think they got this together in a couple of weeks. This is an awesome example that just skyrocketed such a big business. Another great example is Uber. Uber started out as a mobile and SMS combination that was the founders and their closest friends. It was iPhone only and San Francisco only. They had 1 car that you could rent out, and obviously things took off there, and very quickly 1 car wasn't enough. As that demand grew, they started to feel the pressure of the product. So they had to scale, get more cars, more people on the product, and then obviously they started to take it to more locations, more platforms, those kinds of things. The last example is Twitter. So Twitter started out of a hackathon from the founders. They worked at a previous company, and they built this thing in a hackathon, which was meant as an internal application so that their company could communicate and send SMSs to groups, like small groups of people, and what they called tweets. Obviously, they started to validate that this thing actually, people really liked this because people's phone bills were skyrocketing. And so at that point, it was the most logical thing to move to a web-based platform where you could get rid of that problem. And also that opened the door to a wider audience. They could start looking at, okay, do we want to release this out to more people? But once again, they had some core assumptions and they just took it from there. So they just had to focus on what the problem was. They built small features, hackathons. I'm assuming they probably built that in a weekend. And they had heaps of people from their internal business using it, which validated this thing, people liked it. Cool. The next one here is what Jody alluded to, right? So remember when we said earlier that your MVP probably doesn't need to be that special. And that's because it is just the start. You don't want to spend too much on this first phase, because there's a good chance that the moment you get that to users, they're going to use it in a totally different way than you expected. And you're going to have to make changes, and some assumptions are going to be wrong. But obviously you want some of those core assumptions of why you built this product to be correct. And the next phase is all about listening, testing, and applying learnings to your next iterations beyond your MVP. So the first question you should be asking yourself as you come out of the MVP is does your MVP solve the problem? Are you still addressing that problem? So the big thing that comes up here is, do I have to launch to get that validation? And the answer is no. There's obviously, it's a heavy term, launch. And I want to spin that a bit and say that I think when you get your MVP finished, you want to push forward the get your product into any user's hands as soon as possible. It doesn't have to be your big press release or anything like that, but as soon as you can get people using it, the better, because you're going to want to feed that into the next round of development that you're going to do on that product. So you don't want to be making assumptions on top of assumptions in your next run. You would much rather be listening to people that you've given your product to, and then creating and crafting that next iteration around that feedback. So yeah, and obviously once they're in, it's incredibly important to start learning from them. Don't just add people to the product and then think you're done, right? So get it into their hands, book in user testing sessions. It's a great way to oversee the way people interact with your app, and also just talk to them. If you've got a user testing session booked in, during the testing, your job is to probably stay quiet. You're not there to add input. But when they finish the user testing session, have a chat to them, see what they think, see what their thoughts are about the next phase. And as Jordy said, listen to their problems, listen to their pain points. They're going to have ideas of what you should build next. That's your job. Like at the end of the day, it's your job to design the next features, but also part of your job is to listen to your users' problems. And it's important to I guess, acknowledge that the answers to many of the questions you're going to hear in these user testing sessions are probably going to hurt for a while, but you need to dedicate yourself to that iteration. So this is why it's so important to keep your budget for your MVP relative. So don't spend your whole budget on your MVP, because most people, and this is something that many startup founders have tread before, or anyone building software, is that there's going to be assumptions that you got wrong, and you're going to have to pivot on those. So it's very important to allow some room in there for you to create an iterative process and actually learn from what you built in the first run. And it's around this point when you start talking to people about your MVP that you start to maybe question yourself. You start to think, what was the problem right? Am I doing the right thing? Am I the right person to do this? All these kinds of things can come into your mind. And I just want to set the stage here to make a distinction between pivoting and iterating. So pivoting generally means that you are changing your customer or your problem you're trying to solve. And it's worth saying that this should be quite rare. You are literally questioning the journey you've been on so far at that point. You are, as an underlying concept of your app, you are changing everything, right? And it's tempting to say that your solution was perfect, right? You just built something for however long your MVP took, and you want to find new and better users who will appreciate the masterpiece that you just came up with. Instead, you should be saying, why don't they like this thing? And there's a lot of reasons why that might be, and that's where iterating comes in, right? You may have produced a fantastic MVP, but if you're showing it to users that it didn't solve their problem, then it's not fulfilling its need. Sometimes it could just be a bad MVP. There's so many reasons why you may need to iterate the solution. And the idea is this is meant to be incremental improvement, right? Very rarely would you work with a professional development team and you would just wipe clean the MVP. The idea is to build upon what you've learned from what you've built that first run from. Cool. And so with your product out in the wild, it becomes very important to start to think about the metrics that are important to you. So I recommend starting with maybe 5 to 10 metrics that are important to your business, and use an event-based metric gathering system to do these. So an example of something like this would be Instagram tracking people taking photos and then uploading them to their story. So obviously that whole flow is very important to Instagram, but also Instagram would love to know if someone takes a photo and doesn't upload it. These are all important bits of information that you can start to figure out where pain points are in your product. So if 80% of people at Instagram are taking a photo but they're not posting it, I don't know, maybe the button to post isn't in the most obvious place. You can learn from these things and make sure that you're iterating on the product in the areas that are actually causing you problems. It's important to also make sure that these metrics become a central part of all decisions going forward. So get your business involved, get all parts of the business aware of the metrics that are important to you, and talk about them all the time. If you're making a decision, look back to them to help guide your decisions. And I guess a side comment here, and this is more as your product scales, but it is quite important to start thinking about them when you build new requirements. A great way to frame the conversation could be asking yourself, what metric would improve if I built this new feature? And then take it the next layer on and ask yourself, does improving that metric actually matter? By proxy, you're questioning yourself on whether that next requirement is actually worth the development time that you're going to spend on it. Or could we spend it on this other thing that actually moves a metric that we care about? And so the final thing is how do you know when you're there? And by there, I mean product market fit, if that wasn't clear. And so I just want to double back to the definition that Geordie gave, in that if you've made it to product market fit, you're probably going to know. You're going to feel it. Everything's going to be crazy. If you've got a meaningful market that's sizable, things are going to be wild. You're not going to be thinking about have I made it, because you'll be too busy worrying about how the heck am I going to keep my server up and running with 10,000 users on it. Like, that's the thing. The real challenge is actually, how do you know whether the changes you've made are moving the needle in the right direction? You want to make sure that each iteration, and you can compare major release versus last major release, but you want to make sure that 3-4 weeks of development, whatever it was, actually moved the needle in the right direction. And a couple of useful measurements that you can use for this is returning usage. So are people signing up, and then are they returning? That's a really important one. If people are coming back and using your product after they've signed up, there's a fair chance you've created something kind of sticky there. It's hooking them in. NPS score is another really good one. So if you're above 50, it's generally regarded that more than 50% of people are promoting your product. So the general consensus out in the community is that once you get that, you're at a point where you've got word of mouth, it's chugging. You should be finding some exponential growth if you've got more promoters than you do detractors. And the last one is recurring revenue. The first sale is great, but are users willing to continue to pay you? Are they continuing to get value beyond that first payment where they thought this product would be great for them? And yeah, thank you for listening. This was the end of the slides. So I'll pass over to Yanni, who is our question master for today.
Guys, please, if you're thinking anything, feel free to use the chat on the right-hand side. So when you say delivering value, should the value be defined early, and should the requirements be focused around that?
Well, I mean, I'll take this one. I guess that it comes back again to that original problem. So if you're releasing something valuable, you will be solving that problem. But how do you measure that? How do you define it early, and how do you measure it? So yes, it is important to include, I guess, the ability to measure those key metrics in your requirements. So when we're in scoping, obviously we are looking at, we're coming up with ideas on how to solve the problem that will deliver our users value. But how are we going to measure that? So how do we know what's the success criteria look like? We will see this many users using it by this time, or we'll have everyone using the app for this action. So we need to embed the ability to measure those into the requirements as they get built. Hope that answers that one.
Yeah, I think another layer to that is also the assumption you've made. So early on in a product, you're going to make probably big assumptions on what value looks like to your customers, the way you see them, and comparing if that assumption actually panned out to deliver value to your customers is another important question to ask yourself.
Awesome.
Yeah, totally.
So we've got another one here. What is the typical length of development time of an MVP in your experience, and how much money should we budget?
You go, Jake.
That's a fun question. Yeah. So we've recently, Yanni can probably confirm me on this, but we've recently started a package in our company where I believe it's something around the $60,000 to $70,000, which is just based on our charges, of course. That basically includes scoping time and development time, which I think is 2 weeks and 6 weeks. So that's a really ballpark number of something that I believe in our designers. With that amount of time, we can deliver something meaningful that you can then take to the market and start to figure out if that thing is actually doing what you assumed it would.
Yeah. I would add in there too that again, a lot of product owners or products that we work with as well are probably still erring on the side of large MVPs. So projects that are like over the 10, 12 and 15 week mark, they're getting quite large, and they are still trying to solve more than one problem. So if you can, again, zone in on what is the first problem we're going to solve and who are we going to help first, you can really reduce that. And a good example of one we did recently was we sort of started to scope out, again, a big size MVP, and we said, hang on a second, all this is going to fall apart if we don't know if these users are going to follow a link in the text message that we send them. If they don't click on that link, the rest we build is a waste. So let's just build that first. Let's build something that sends the text message out. They follow the link and they land on a home screen, and we're giving them a bit of information. That's it. And that unlocked this company to then go on and build for a number of weeks more. But that was the smallest thing that they solved first, which was really great.
It's really hard as well. There's so many ways that you can tackle an MVP. There's been companies out there in the past that have their MVP was literally a demonstration video of a theoretical platform. And because they got signups, that validated their assumption, right? That was a non-software MVP, right? And then you've got the floodgates are then open to then take it to the next level and start to build your software with those assumptions stamped out. So
cool. I've got my own question here. So what's a good number of people to validate your problem with? There's examples that we see out there where people are calling 10,000 businesses to validate. Is there a good number? And if so, do you have any ideas of what that might be?
You go, Jody. I took first last time.
There's a number of different ways to validate. So I would say 10,000 is an extreme case, but obviously making 10,000 phone calls may have provided them a different kind of value. But what we predominantly do at WorkingMouse is perform discovery interviews, first of all. So they are one-on-one chats with user groups, and then we progress into user testing. So putting the prototypes that we're designing in front of users and getting them to click through. And it's well known, research too, that beyond 3 to 5 users that you're doing that kind of intensive user testing with, you start to see the same results. They start repeating themselves. So actually 3 to 5 people is not that many. You just need to make sure you're doing it often. So test with less people more often. If you're doing that every couple of weeks, it shouldn't be too intensive on your budget, but it'll give you the right amount of data to move forward.
It also depends as well. Like I think, Jordy, you really focused there on, I guess, validating the product. So you can also, there's also validating a market, which can be different. And that's where scale can actually come in more benefit than product. So if you are validating a market, it can be more useful because you're trying to get a sample size. But for a product, like Jordy said, you're going to find after 3 to 5 people, you're going to be getting the same responses if you are user testing the right people.
Cool. We've got a good one here. So we've been adopting this framework of building an MVP, but what do you do when your initial user base are asking you for the finished product to test themselves rather than an MVP? Is that a typical question, and is it just a matter of finding the right target user, or do you need to sort of feed that back a little bit?
I think for this one, it's probably important to, like you just said, to define the user. So who are your first users? So those people are quite important, right? They have to be willing to be that early adopter in a lot of ways because they are using, more than likely a subpar product to what you would eventually deliver. There is examples where you may have a use case where the MVP is not enough to launch, right? And that can be because of many reasons, like legislation, all of those kinds of things. And that's just one of those things about the market you've potentially picked, right? Sometimes the problem you're trying to solve means that you have to spend more time to get to an MVP, but I still think it's an MVP because you haven't validated any of your assumptions. All it's doing is just a more expensive experiment at that point, but that's part of the market that you've chosen. If you need to go down that avenue, then that's just how it is in some cases.
Yeah, I would say in those situations, get creative in the most lo-fi way you can test the concept. So if you can think of testing it without building the software first, in those organizations, or run an experiment with them, then that's really important before you take that risk of building a larger MVP or a finished product almost is what you're kind of getting at.
Cool. So I'll ask this question and then we might have time for one more. Is the best method a number of people, or could it include a stakeholder group to ensure that the correct groups are targeted? So more broadly, how do you test with multiple user groups?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And so, yeah, I would say the number is probably relative to the user group. I mean, if you've got different user groups using the same, I guess, process, then you could probably get a mix in your 3 to 5 every couple of weeks. But if there are different user journeys that those different stakeholder groups are taking, then yes, trying to get 3 to 5 of each of those is quite important. But if budgets are worried, then you could, be testing one user journey one week and the other user journey the next week. So that's a less intensive way to do it.
Can you explain user journey for us, Geordie, just when there's different user journeys in a product?
Yeah, so different user journeys. I mean, if you're mapping it out on a whiteboard, they're the different actions a user would take. So we might have someone on the front end of a website who doesn't have a login, so they're a guest. They can do this action A, B, and C. Whereas someone who has a login might do action A, D, E, F. And the admins have a different workflow altogether. I hope that makes sense.
Cool. So last one, when you have product market fit, how do you make sure you don't lose it?
Metrics.
Yep.
Exactly. Yeah, so back to the metrics part that we sort of mentioned. If you've defined those metrics and you're continually tracking those and adding new ones, as well as those ones we mentioned around like returning visits, NPS, you need to keep measuring those things. And each time you make a new iteration, do it again and find new people to test, get new information from your new users. That's the best way to do it. It's basically the only way to do it, to be honest, is continue to track what's happening on your product.
But as you have built up to that point, you hopefully you have covered the entire product in a way to measure every aspect of it. So all those metrics that you're setting up in the beginning should just keep paying off for you to enable you to keep doing that.
It's probably also worth mentioning as well, keep doing user testing. If you've got new features coming out, that's another great way to make sure that people are actually excited or looking forward to those new things that you're working on, is to test it with them and make sure you're iterating against their feedback.
Awesome. Thanks for that, guys. So
Thank you,
we'll be
everyone.
making slides available to everyone via email, so please keep an eye out for that. The session will also be made available on our website, so feel free to share it with anyone you think might be interested. And if you have any further questions for Jake or Geordie, feel free to contact us. Yeah, thank you very much for jumping on, and thanks, Jake and Geordie, for running the session.
Thank you, Question
No
Master.
worries. Have a great day. Thanks, guys.
Have a good day, everyone.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.